Every empire swears its money is safe. Every superpower insists its currency will last forever, and every time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were solid. Today, that same warning echoes in the corridors of Washington, New York, and Riyadh. The dollar, the bedrock of global finance for decades, may no longer be untouchable. The petrodollar, the system that made the US dollar the world's dominant reserve currency, has been the invisible hand shaping global trade, war, and wealth accumulation since the 1970s. But like every financial system in history, its reign is not guaranteed. The story begins with oil, black gold, the lifeblood of the modern world. After World War II, the US dollar became the linchpin of the global financial system. Bretton Woods established it as the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold. The rest of the world's currencies floated relative to the dollar, giving Washington unparalleled leverage. Yet even then, the system had cracks. Countries were free to accumulate dollars, but the US had no real constraints on printing them. History had already shown that unlimited promises can be a fatal temptation. The petrodollar, however, added a layer of security. In the early 1970s, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. Sell your oil exclusively in dollars, and we guarantee your security. Other OPEC nations quickly followed. Suddenly, every barrel of oil on the planet required US dollars. The world needed greenbacks just to keep its lights on. For decades, this gave the United States an almost magical economic power. Trade deficits were sustainable. Foreign governments bought US debt with minimal hesitation. America could borrow, spend, and project military power with an ease few empires in history had ever enjoyed. But as history reminds us, nothing lasts forever. For every empire that believed in its permanence, collapse began quietly, unnoticed at first, like a hairline crack in marble. The petrodollar's fragility lies in its dependence on trust. Trust that the United States will remain politically stable, militarily dominant, and economically disciplined. Yet cracks have appeared over decades. The Iraq War, the financial crisis of 2008, and growing global resentment toward U.S. unilateralism have eroded confidence. Each crisis was a test of faith, a reminder that the dollar's power is, ultimately, a social contract, nothing more. And then there is China. For decades, Beijing quietly built an economic machine unlike any the world had seen. Manufacturing, exports, and reserves gave China leverage, but more importantly, it began breaking the rules of the petrodollar system. By negotiating oil contracts in yuan, creating alternative payment systems, and pushing for regional currencies in trade, China challenges the implicit agreement that oil must flow through US dollars. History has always punished those who ignore the slow erosion of trust. Just as Byzantine emperors debased their gold and French revolutionaries printed assonance, the over-reliance on a single currency now faces the risk of dilution, not by coins, but by geopolitics and global strategic realignment. The consequences of this shift are not abstract. Imagine the United States facing rising trade deficits while foreign nations begin to diversify their reserves away from the dollar. Treasury yields could spike, borrowing costs would rise, dollar-denominated assets, long seen as safe havens, could tumble. Ordinary Americans might feel the first tremors in rising inflation, skyrocketing energy prices, and the slow erosion of purchasing power. Meanwhile, global markets accustomed to dollar liquidity would scramble for alternatives. The institutions built on petrodollar dominance, banks, hedge funds, even governments, would be forced to rethink decades of assumptions. But history is never fair. While the collapse of confidence punishes those who cling to illusions, it rewards those who prepare. Just as merchants hoarded gold when Byzantine coins were debased, investors and nations positioning themselves in tangible assets, diversified currencies, and strategic commodities will be the ones who survive and thrive. Oil-rich nations, for example, may find that controlling barrels is no longer enough. Controlling trade agreements, alternative currencies, and storage infrastructure may matter far more. Those who recognize the shifting tectonics before the cracks widen will hold the keys to wealth when the system inevitably recalibrates. The petrodollar has been a silent enforcer of U.S. global dominance for nearly half a century, but history is blunt in its lessons. Nothing that appears permanent truly is. The dollar's supremacy, like the solidus of Byzantium or the assignats of revolutionary France, is built on trust. Trust can evaporate, and when it does, the consequences are swift, brutal, and far-reaching. Every empire that has believed its money indestructible has paid a price. Every citizen who has trusted unquestioningly has lost. We are entering an era where the illusion of permanence is being tested. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed a unique position. Global consumer, global creditor, and global policeman, all funded by a currency that everyone needed. But the rise of multipolar trade, alternative currencies, and digital assets threatens to undermine the structure. The dollar may not collapse tomorrow, but the subtle shifts in global trust are accumulating, and the signs are unmistakable. Just as history teaches us, waiting for the system to fail before acting is a recipe for ruin. If the first section warned of fragility, this one confronts inevitability. Every system in history that seemed untouchable has faltered. Rome, Byzantium, France, and even modern Lebanon prove the same pattern. The higher the pedestal, the harsher the fall. The petrodollar's dominance, while unprecedented in scale, is not immune. From subtle erosion to outright geopolitical rebellion, the reign of the dollar is being challenged in ways that history has always warned about. Look first to Russia and China, who have both strategically decoupled portions of their trade from the dollar, energy deals in yuan or rubles, regional payment systems bypassing SWIFT, and strategic reserves of gold and commodities all serve as a hedge against dollar dependency. At the same time, countries in the global south, frustrated with the constraints of a US-dominated financial system, are exploring barter agreements, crypto assets, and gold-backed alternatives. The message is clear. The dollar is no longer the only game in town. History repeats in patterns, not dates. The collapse of confidence in the petrodollar will not come as a single cataclysmic event. It will arrive through shocks and slow erosion alike. Political instability, mismanaged debt, inflationary policies, or global crises could accelerate the process. Already the world has seen hints, periods of dollar weakness triggering spikes in commodity prices, currency wars, and the recalibration of trade balances. Each tremor is a reminder that global trust is both fragile and finite. And yet, the human story within these collapses remains constant. Those who recognize the fragility of the system first, the central banks diversifying reserves, the investors hedging with commodities, the nations cultivating strategic alliances, will survive. Those who trust blindly in the continuation of old agreements, like assignat holders in revolutionary France, will see value evaporate. This is not mere theory. It is a recurring theme in financial history. Collapse is never just abstract. It manifests in lost savings, bankrupt institutions, and geopolitical chaos. For the United States, the stakes are existential. The petrodollar has allowed unprecedented borrowing, military projection, and economic influence. A gradual erosion would reduce this leverage, forcing domestic policy, defense strategy, and international diplomacy to adapt in ways previously unimagined. Citizens, too, would feel the consequences: inflation, reduced global purchasing power, and the slow recalibration of living standards. History teaches that the first victims of a collapsing currency are those who assumed permanence. But history also teaches preparation. If the dollar's reign ends, the opportunity lies not in despair, but in adaptation. Tangible assets, diversified portfolios, and strategic foresight will define winners in the new order. Energy independence, control over critical supply chains, and investment in real resources will matter far more than mere paper promises. Nations and individuals who adapt quickly can leverage the chaos to their advantage, much as survivors of the Black Death acquired land, or astute investors thrived after the 2008 financial crisis. The story of the petrodollar is not just about currency. It is about power, influence, and the invisible architecture that underpins global trade. Oil is no longer merely a commodity. It is a tool, a weapon, and a barometer of trust. The dollar is no longer merely money. It is the symbol of global confidence. And symbols can fracture as quickly as coins debase. History shows us that wealth is preserved not by blind faith, but by understanding value that cannot be printed, borrowed, or defaulted upon. In this unfolding chapter, survival is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and strategic. Whether through diversification, alliances, or tangible assets, those who recognize the shifting tides will navigate the transition with resilience. And those who ignore the lessons of history will find themselves holding paper promises as the world's financial architecture transforms around them. The fall of the petrodollar is not a distant theory. It is a historical inevitability manifesting in real time, and its echoes will be felt in homes, markets, and boardrooms across the globe. Like every collapse before it, the pattern is clear. Trust will erode, assets will transfer, and those prepared to act will survive and even thrive. In the end, the lesson is timeless. Systems rise and fall, currencies dominate and vanish, empires project power and crumble. The petrodollar's reign is a chapter in this long story, one that history has written countless times before. Survival is not a matter of hoping the system endures. It is a matter of recognizing fragility, preparing for change, and positioning oneself where value cannot be destroyed. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and if you listen closely, it whispers the truth. The reign of the dollar, like all empires before it, is not eternal. The question is simple. Will you be among those clinging to promises, or among the few holding what is real when the world recalibrates? Every empire that believed in the permanence of its currency has discovered the same brutal truth. Stability is an illusion, and trust can vanish overnight. Rome, Byzantium, France, and even modern Lebanon all left behind the same warning etched in history. What is secure today may be worthless tomorrow. And today, the world watches the dollar with a mixture of reverence and fear. The petrodollar has underpinned global trade, debt, and military influence for decades. But as history whispers through the corridors of financial institutions from New York to Beijing, cracks are widening, and the ripples are beginning to touch every corner of the globe. The first truth of a declining reserve currency is stark. The transfer of wealth is inevitable. Those who have relied exclusively on the dollar, governments, corporations, and ordinary citizens, are exposed. Emerging markets with heavy dollar-denominated debt are especially vulnerable. As the dollar loses dominance, borrowing costs spike. Loans that were once manageable suddenly become crushing. National budgets strain, unemployment rises, and inflation surges. The ordinary citizens of these nations, just like the depositors of Florence in the 14th century or the holders of assignats in revolutionary Paris, bear the brunt of the collapse. China, Russia, and other strategic actors understand this better than anyone. They are quietly creating alternative financial architectures to reduce dependence on the dollar. Swap agreements between central banks, regional currency blocks, and the promotion of gold-backed or digital alternatives all serve a single purpose: to insulate themselves from U.S. monetary fluctuations. History has always favored those who prepare early. During the Black Death, those with liquidity acquired land at a fraction of its former cost. After the collapse of Confederate currency, those with hard assets survived, while paper money became a cruel joke. The modern parallel is clear. Nations and institutions that position themselves outside the dollar system are likely to emerge stronger as the global order recalibrates. Yet the story is never simple. The decline of the dollar is not merely economic, it is deeply geopolitical. Energy markets, long the engine of U.S. influence, are undergoing subtle but profound transformation. Middle Eastern nations, once loyal to the dollar out of necessity, are exploring trade agreements in euros, yuan, or even digital currencies. Africa and Latin America, regions that historically relied on U.S. and European financing, are increasingly open to Chinese investment and new currency arrangements. Each of these shifts chips away at the implicit global monopoly the dollar has enjoyed. History has always punished those who cling to dominance without adaptability. The lesson of empires, from the Byzantines to Napoleonic France, is consistent. Power is preserved only through flexibility, not arrogance. For the United States, the decline of the petrodollar would not be gradual. It would unfold in stages, much like the collapse of Florence's banking houses in the 14th century. First comes the erosion of confidence. Central banks may diversify reserves, commodity markets might adjust, and investors may question the reliability of U.S. debt. Then comes the market response. Interest rates rise, stock markets wobble, and currency volatility becomes a constant threat. Finally comes the societal impact. Inflation bites, wages stagnate, and the social contract frays. Ordinary Americans, unaware of the systemic shift until its effects reach their doorstep, may be forced to confront the fragility of a financial system they assumed was permanent. But, as history teaches, every crisis carries within it opportunity. Survival is not a matter of passively trusting institutions, but actively understanding the underlying mechanisms of value. Those with diversified portfolios, strategic reserves of commodities, and access to alternative currencies will navigate this period with resilience. Nations that control energy, technology, or critical trade routes can leverage the uncertainty to consolidate influence. The story is remarkably familiar. When Rome's silver denarius was debased, merchants with gold survived. When the assignats of revolutionary France became worthless, those with property or food thrived. When modern Lebanon's banks froze deposits, those with diversified assets retained stability. The pattern is universal. Even more striking is the lesson for ordinary individuals. Skills, production, and the ability to create value become far more important than paper wealth. The baker who can provide food, the engineer who can maintain infrastructure, the farmer who can supply essential commodities, these are the true holders of value when currency falters. During every historical collapse, from pandemics to civil wars, those who could produce survived and often prospered, even when money itself became meaningless. In a post-petrodollar world, this lesson will be no different. Real assets and real skills will define the winners, while blind reliance on a single currency will guarantee the losers. And then there's the digital dimension. Unlike past collapses, today's financial systems are intertwined with technology. Cryptocurrencies, digital banking, and decentralized finance offer alternatives to the traditional dollar system. These tools are imperfect, volatile, and nascent, but history favors those willing to experiment, adapt, and hedge against systemic failure. Just as merchants once hoarded tangible goods to survive Byzantine debasement, today's innovators and investors can hedge their exposure to a weakening dollar through technology, global assets, and diversified portfolios. The medium changes, but the principle remains. Value lies in what cannot be arbitrarily created or destroyed. The fall of the petrodollar is not merely an economic story. It is a story of power, trust, and adaptation. The dollar's decline will reshape trade, military alliances, and global influence. Nations that were once peripheral may find themselves at the center of new financial networks. Institutions that relied on dollar dominance may crumble, while agile, forward-looking actors consolidate power. The echoes of Florence, France, and Lebanon remind us that stability is temporary and preparation is eternal. Ultimately, the lesson is stark and unyielding. History does not reward those who cling to illusions of permanence. It rewards those who anticipate change, diversify, and understand the difference between promises and tangible value. The petrodollar's era has been long, powerful, and transformative, but its decline is now part of the inevitable cycle that is repeated throughout human history. The question is not whether the dollar will falter. It is a matter of when and who will be ready to navigate the storm when it does. In every collapse, some lose everything, and some gain everything. The fall of the petrodollar will be no different. The world is shifting. The balance of power is recalibrating. And history, as always, is watching, offering lessons, warnings, and opportunities to those who listen carefully enough to act. Every empire that believed its money could endure forever eventually confronted reality. From the Roman denarius to revolutionary France's assignats, from the Confederate graybacks to Lebanon's frozen bank accounts, history has always shown the same pattern. The higher the trust, the sharper the fall. And now, the world watches as the dollar, long considered the unassailable anchor of global finance, faces unprecedented challenges. The decline of the petrodollar is not just a financial story, it is a story of geopolitics, influence, and the shifting balance of power that will touch every nation, every institution, and every individual. The first tremor comes in trade and commodities. For decades, oil priced exclusively in dollars created an ecosystem where every nation needed greenbacks just to keep its lights on. Global trade, debt repayment, and commodity markets all revolved around the U.S. currency. But as nations diversify reserves and negotiate contracts in alternative currencies, yuan, euros, even digital currencies, the once clear advantage of dollar dominance begins to fade. Oil-producing countries, from the Middle East to Africa, now have more leverage than ever. They can dictate terms, demand payment in currencies of their choosing, and reduce their exposure to U.S. economic policy. The implications are profound. Nations that relied on dollar-denominated trade are suddenly vulnerable, while those who adapt early gain strategic advantage. History offers a chilling parallel. When Florence's banks collapsed in the 14th century, Europe did not merely face localized banking failures. Trade froze, economies contracted, and social unrest followed. The lesson is clear. Financial systems are interconnected, and the failure of a dominant currency is not isolated. A declining dollar will not merely shift exchange rates. It will ripple through global supply chains, debt obligations, and financial markets, creating winners and losers on a massive scale. Nations heavily reliant on U.S. imports or exports may face sudden economic shocks, while nimble, diversified economies will capture market share and influence. Meanwhile, geopolitics adjusts to economic realities. Historically, currency power has been inseparable from military and political influence. Rome projected power through silver coinage. Britain dominated the world through the pound sterling, and the United States leveraged the dollar to finance military campaigns, secure alliances, and influence global institutions. As the petrodollar weakens, the U.S. may find its leverage diminished. Trade sanctions, defense agreements, and international diplomacy all rely, subtly or overtly, on the assumption of dollar dominance. Without it, negotiating power decreases, forcing a recalibration of strategy and alliances. History has repeatedly shown that shifts in financial power quickly translate into shifts in political and military influence. At the same time, emerging powers are not waiting passively. China, for example, has invested decades in creating parallel financial systems designed to bypass the dollar. The Belt and Road Initiative is not merely an infrastructure project. It is a strategy to integrate economies into a network less dependent on U.S. currency. Russia, facing sanctions and financial isolation, has aggressively moved to trade energy in rubles and accumulate gold and alternative reserves. Even smaller nations, from Turkey to Iran, experiment with barter systems, cryptocurrency, and alternative payment platforms. Each move chips away at the implicit global monopoly the dollar once held, echoing the slow erosion of trust that toppled great empires in the past. The human story within this economic shift remains constant. Ordinary citizens, as always, are caught between systems they cannot control and the invisible mechanisms of global finance. History shows that during collapse, those with foresight and adaptability thrive, while those who cling to the familiar suffer. After the Black Death, peasants who acquired land rose in social status. During the 2008 financial crisis, those with liquidity acquired distressed assets and prospered. Today, as the dollar faces decline, individuals who diversify their holdings, invest in tangible assets, and cultivate skills resilient to systemic shocks will navigate the turbulence more successfully than those dependent solely on a single currency. Yet the risks are also profound and unprecedented. Unlike past collapses, today's financial systems are deeply intertwined with technology, information networks, and globalized trade. A weakening dollar could spark rapid volatility across stock markets, bond markets, and digital asset platforms simultaneously. Governments may respond with intervention, capital controls, or unconventional monetary policies. Individuals may witness inflation, purchasing power erosion, and a gradual restructuring of wealth distribution.